First, I'd like to thank the CPGB for inviting Spencer and me to speak at the Communist University. I think what led up to my speaking here today is our invitation to Mike McNair to speak at our convention in Chicago at the end of last April, which Comrade McNair wrote a series of articles and report on that convention in the Weekly Worker. And I think that we've had a pretty nice, lively exchange in the Weekly Worker. And so basically, I think that one of the things that happened in that exchange was something that Mike commented on in his article, Divided by a Common Language. Namely, the potential that we would sort of speak past each other in the exchange based on our different use or sort of understanding of common terminology. And so I'm going to, as part of my presentation, address the assumptions and categories that I and others in Platypus work with. And in that respect, I'm going to address the issue of theoretical self-reflection and the potential relationship to practical politics, somewhat indirectly, through the question of the philosophy of history. And the terms that I'm going to be sort of emphasizing and putting pressure on are specifically bourgeois, what is meant by the bourgeois, and specifically the use of that term in the phrase bourgeois society. I think that one of the sort of tricky things that I'm going to be navigating in terms of my self-understanding, my approach to the issues that I'm going to be discussing, is the difficulty and sort of treacherous quality of trying to make what I take to be sort of esoteric content of Marxism explicit and exoteric. And there's always a sort of danger in doing that. In taking dialectical categories that are inherently dialectical in the history of Marxism, and explaining them or defining them and sort of elaborating on their use. And so I think that one of the issues in contention between me and Mike in the exchange in the Weekly Worker, at least from my perspective in terms of the emphasis that I've tried to bring out, is the status of the German idealist background for Marx and Engels, and for Marxism. And by German idealist philosophy, if we can call it that, I mean, of course, Kant and Hegel. And in that respect, it's not just German idealism in the sense that these were German thinkers, but rather it's modern idealism as opposed to ancient idealist philosophy. And the reason that I say whether we can talk about this as philosophy is that one of the things that I'm going to be talking about is the sort of changed status for something like philosophy in bourgeois society, in modern society. And so there's a question of what I've called in one of my articles to the Weekly Worker, the Kantian revolution in philosophy, whether that means that thinkers like Kant and Hegel, and the degree to which Marx follows them, whether it's really philosophy at all, whether we're talking about philosophy at all. And I'm going to be drawing upon, in my presentation, specifically thinkers that are associated with the sort of point of departure for Frankfurt School critical theory, namely Georg Lukács, Karl Korsch, Walter Benjamin, and Theodor Adorno. And I would say that this question of whether this is philosophy, or even what the status of this as theory is actually a big question. In other words, I would say these thinkers, Lukács, Benjamin, Adorno, are not philosophers, and there's even a question of what's meant by them being theorists, right? So that's my sort of initial kind of framing for the way I want to talk about this. So why do I think that this is important? I think that it bears upon Marxism in the present and the possibility of Marxism in the present, with respect to what I take to be sort of blurred, forgotten, and lost horizons of possibility that were crucial and were the sort of underlying assumptions for Marxism at the outset, namely for Marx and Engels themselves, and also for the generation of Marxists that I consider to be crucial in any understanding of the history of Marxism, what I call the Second International Radicals, namely Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, that there was a sort of an underlying set of assumptions about the place of capital in history, or bourgeois society in history, that informed their self-understanding of what Marxism was about. And I think that over the course of the 20th century leading up to the present, those original assumptions, those sort of baseline underlying assumptions about history, have been lost, and that this has really disabled Marxism, has disabled what people have come to understand by Marxism. That those assumptions have subtly gone away. And some categories that we have for addressing that in the history of the literature are from Karl Korsch and Georg Lukács, namely vulgar Marxism. Vulgar Marxism. What is vulgar Marxism? Namely, that we have a history of writing from the history of Marxism, in which we have propagandistic pamphlets written by people including Marx and Engels, but also Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, in which, again, they do not make the esoteric, or what I take to be the esoteric content, always explicit or exoteric, and rather it's a matter of sort of gleaning it from their published writings and the writings that most people refer to, which shouldn't be such a tricky exegetical sort of task in terms of bringing out this content, but ends up being, because of course these were not, Luxemburg and Lenin and Trotsky, they didn't write philosophical treatises, they didn't write theoretical texts, and so I'm taking very seriously the idea that Lukács had of trying to give an account of the theory that Luxemburg and Lenin had in common, trying to bring out the sort of internal coherence of these Marxists' thought and self-understanding. So the handout that I've given is a selection from Marx's Grundrisse, which is, of course, itself a rather esoteric text, or a text that wasn't necessarily available, for instance, to Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, at least not to the first two, because it was sort of, discovered and published later. I want to sort of go through this. I have sort of two versions of the key part of the quotation from the Grundrisse. The first is, just to sort of indicate where this is coming from, is a version of the quotation that I first myself came across in Juliet Mitchell's essay in New Left Review from 1966, Women the Longest Revolution. It's given slightly differently in the version from the Grundrisse below, and so I'm just sort of flagging it. I'm going to read from the published version of Marx's Grundrisse rather than from Juliet Mitchell's quoted version. There's just one word in Juliet Mitchell's version that is significantly changed, and that's progress. The way she rendered it was, what is progress? And in the longer quotation is, what is evolution? So there's a little bit of rhetorical slippage there, but otherwise, it's the same. So this is Marx. The ancient conception in which man always appears, in however narrowly national, religious, or political a definition, as the aim of production, seems very much more exalted than in the modern world, in which production is the aim of man, and wealth the aim of production. In fact, however, when the narrow bourgeois form has been peeled away, what is wealth if not the universality of needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive powers, etc., of individuals, produced in universal exchange? What, if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, those of his own nature, as well as those of so-called nature? What, if not the absolute elaboration of his creative dispositions, without any preconditions other than antecedent historical evolution, which make the totality of this evolution, i.e. the evolution of all human powers as such, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself. What is this, if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but produces his totality, where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming? In bourgeois political economy, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete elaboration of what lies within man appears as the total alienation and the destruction of all fixed, one-sided purposes, as the sacrifice of the end in itself to a wholly external compulsion. Hence, in one way, the childlike world of the ancients appears to be superior. And this is so, insofar as we seek for closed shape, form, and established limitation. The ancients provide a narrow satisfaction, whereas the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or where it appears to be satisfied with itself is vulgar and mean. So, just to tease out some things. In the very first sentence, Marx is establishing a distinction between ancient humanity and modern humanity. For ancient humanity, man is the aim of production. In other words, all of the practices that humans engage in are aimed at producing humanity in a certain form. Whereas in the modern world, production is the aim of humanity. And for Marx, that means that this is open-ended in a way that it wasn't for the ancients. And that gives our condition an unsatisfied, restless quality. Right? We are dissatisfied with our condition in a way that the ancients were not. This is key because what Marx is drawing upon here is in fact something thematized very strongly in the German idealist tradition, going back to Rousseau, in fact, in the mid-18th century. And that's a distinction between freedom in the modern sense and freedom in the ancient sense. Freedom in the ancient sense is freedom to be, freedom to exist in integral being, to be what you are, right? So to not be conquered and enslaved by another people, right? To not suffer harm to your integral being, but rather to be Spartan or Athenian or Jewish, although that category didn't exist back then, right? In terms of the sort of ancient literature and ancient scripture, that's what it meant to be free, to be what you are. Whereas for moderns, our freedom is not to be what we are, but rather to be able to transcend what we are, to become, right? And this, I'm going to be using this board a little bit. This will be my first set of categories that I want to put up, which is specifically distinction, but also relation between being and becoming. And in the modern idealist language, this refers to the distinction and the relation between what is versus what ought to be. Right? The is and the ought, in terms of Kant and Hegel. What is versus what ought to be. What could be and what should be versus what is. Right? Or, to elaborate it in slightly different form, the given and the new. Right? What's given versus what's new. And in Hegel, as well as in Kant, but in Hegel, this is nature and spirit. Right, so you have a dialectic of being and becoming, a dialectic of nature and spirit. Nature, using this sort of connotation in German as opposed to in English, is everything that we're born into. It's history, it's culture, as well as physical nature. Right, it's everything that is, everything that's given to us. Versus what is in the process of becoming, what's emerging, what could be, what should be, what ought to be, is what spirit refers to. Right? So you have a dialectic of being and becoming, a dialectic of nature and spirit, in which spirit is the emergent and the new, and nature is the given, and to put a finer point on it, the ever-same. The ever-same. The ever-same.
Ever-same.
Yeah. Right. So the question then is, how do we understand bourgeois society with respect to this dialectic of being and becoming? And so for this, I'm going to erase this board and move on to the next set of categories, namely the historical categories. I think that there's a lot of actual discussion in the Weekly Worker with respect to the post-Neolithic condition of humanity, right? The post-Neolithic revolution condition of humanity with respect to the earlier period and a potential overcoming of the Neolithic condition. So the Paleolithic, the post-Neolithic, and then potentially a sort of really post-Neolithic condition. And I'd like to sort of address that because I think that one of the differences, perhaps, but also one of the points of contact, is with respect to how one imagines this history. And so, rather than discussing the Paleolithic, I know there's a lot of discussion of the human revolution in terms of the Paleolithic revolution. I'm really going to start my narrative rather with the history of civilization. Right? So, the sort of 10,000 BC moment. Of the Neolithic or agricultural revolution, in which, right, this sort of, from our perspective, the first major transformation of humanity with respect to civilization takes place, and that's the movement from the essential condition of humanity, being nomadic hunter-gatherers, to peasants, to settled agriculturalists. Right? So the agricultural revolution changes the basic condition of humanity from nomadic hunter-gatherer to settled agriculturalists or peasants. And that the history of civilization can be understood in one respect as the history of a traditional civilization pastoral life based essentially on a peasant way of life. So that even in terms of the kind of classical history, like when we think about the Old Testament, like sort of scriptural history, we get a view of Egypt, right, from the standpoint of the ancient Jews with respect to their enslavement in Egypt. But of course, the sort of mute background for that story is the mass of peasants in the Nile River Valley who were the real basis of that society. In other words, that society wasn't based on the labor of the slaves. It was based on the mode of production of the peasants. Traditional civilization, in this respect, with the Neolithic Revolution, we could call it the transformation of humanity, but also the crisis of humanity. Right, one of the first major crisis of humanity with respect to our own present standpoint. Traditional civilization, of course, the modern period is about the breakdown of traditional civilization. And over the past several hundred years, the rise of bourgeois society. Now, this is the category that I want to put pressure on in terms of my own assumptions with respect to this change. The rise of bourgeois society, in the way that I understand it, is the replacement of a human community based on a peasant way of life by a new form of human community, really the rise of society per se, bourgeois society, bourgeois in the literal sense of the term, meaning urban space, in which the essential condition of humanity goes from being predominantly the condition of the peasants, rather to the condition of the workers. In other words, the peasant way of life is broken down. The entire civilizational structure of this way of life based on the peasantry, which is, of course, a caste system, right, breaks down in favor of a society based on the condition of the workers. And so we have pastoral or rural peasants as the essential condition of humanity being replaced by urban workers. Right, and of course, it's only in the late 20th century that it literally becomes the case that the majority of human beings give up a peasant way of life in favor of an urban way of life. Although very paradoxically, because we have the rise of slum cities, right? And so it's an urban way of life as opposed to a rural pastoral way of life. But whether or not this means actually achieving the status of bourgeois society in the sense of people being wage laborers, workers, is very much unclear. What they are is potential workers. Right? Now, I want to sort of emphasize this change that takes place between traditional civilization and bourgeois society, because it's massive and it involves something more than just an economic change. Right? But there's something very specific about even conceiving of this history, this long durée history going back to 10,000 BC, in the way that I'm laying it out. In other words, to regard the history of humanity in terms of the history of modes of production. Or in other words, what sense does it make to refer to pre-Neolithic revolution human community as one of hunter-gatherers, right? That doesn't really relate to their own self-conception. Right? In other words, human self-conception wouldn't have been, oh, we're the hunter-gatherers, right? Neither would it have been the case in traditional civilization that the self-understanding of this human community would have been, oh, we're peasants and those who exploit the labor of the peasants, namely the priests and the warrior caste, right? The dominant castes of traditional civilization. In fact, the peasants, in a sense, didn't count, right? They're the mass of commoners, right? They are, those who don't understand the divine, the unwashed masses, or they're those without honor, right? From the standpoint of the first estate and the second estate, the mass of the third estate, the peasants, for most of this history, don't really count in terms of the essential human community. So in Europe, the essential human community was Christendom, right? First estate, of course, the priestly caste, and the second estate, the warrior caste, the aristocracy, those who by the grace of God are defenders of the faith, because you've got to do something with these people. So you anoint them and say they're the defenders of Christendom. But again, right, what we have here is a self-understanding in which it wouldn't have been understood that the essence of this human community was the peasant way of life or the agricultural mode of production. Right? This doesn't correspond to the self-understanding of people in that epoch, these many thousands of years at all. This breaks down, and the breakdown of this allows for the rise of bourgeois society. And I want to sort of emphasize the multifarious aspect of this breakdown because it bears on the larger argument that I'm making. Namely, this is not merely an economic transformation in which people go from producing agriculturally to producing as workers in the sort of manufacturing, later industrial process. But rather, it's a revolution, we could say, in all the various aspects of human life. Namely, it is an economic transformation But it's also a religious and cultural transformation. Namely, it involves the transformation of Christendom in Europe, the Protestant Reformation, the first heresy that's not put down, essentially, which spells the end of Christendom, essentially, the end of religion as it had been practiced for thousands of years. It's economic, religious, and cultural. It's political. It involves a transformation in, and we might even say the emergence of, politics. It's also philosophical, right, in the sense of the philosophical enlightenment. It's technical and scientific, the scientific revolution. And also involves other fundamental practices, such as art. Right. And there's a Hegelian way of talking about this that I think that Marx appropriates. Namely, this idea that it's in bourgeois society, it's as a function of this manifold transformation, that these different domains of human life, human practices, attain to their concept. In other words, become themselves. Right? Going back to my earlier set of categories of being and becoming. In other words, that it almost makes no sense to talk about the economy of traditional civilization. Right? That the rise of bourgeois society is the rise of the economy, per se. Similarly, politics. Right? Was there politics in European Christendom, for example, right? In the way that we understand the concept of politics, right? Or rather, do we have the emergence of politics? Philosophy, that's another good one. In other words, philosophy would appear to be, the love of thinking, systematic thought, would appear to have a history of thousands of years. But in another respect, it only attains to its concept, becomes itself, with bourgeois society. Similarly, science. Right? How do we understand ancient practices? Are they primitive form of science? Or are they something else? Is there a qualitative transformation involved in the scientific revolution, which amounts to the emergence of science per se? Art is another example. I'm an art history professor, so this is an area that's sort of dear to me. Namely, art. Does art exist before bourgeois society? Right? Certainly there's a history of art prior to bourgeois society, but isn't that the appropriation of past practices to a modern conception of art? In other words, that we project back from the present a history of art, going back to cave drawings. Right? Even though, especially in terms of human self-understanding, there's almost no relationship between what ancient peoples did and what we do in terms of aesthetic objectification. Right? What an artist thinks that they're doing now is very different from what an artist or someone engaged in aesthetic objectification did in the past. Right? So all of these domains appear to emerge, become themselves, attain to their concept only in the modern era. They don't really apply. Now, of course, we have some interesting paradoxes with respect to this, namely classical antiquity. Right? In other words, we owe a lot of these categories to classical antiquity. The economy, politics, art, science, right? These are terms that are used in classical antiquity. And so there's a question. Didn't these practices pre-exist modernity? What I would raise is the question of what makes classical antiquity classical. In other words, what makes us select out of the manifold and various multifarious practices of the ancient world, select these as precursors to our own practices. Right? What makes them classical? Because certainly, for many generations of traditional civilization, this thought would not have been considered classical in any sense. In other words, it would have been considered pagan thought, heathen thought. It would have been considered pre-enlightened, in fact. In other words, before people had heard the word of Christ, right? Before they had found salvation through Christ. That's when people were...
So you didn't catch the word before Christ?
No, Christ.
Christ.
Yeah, they hadn't heard the word of Christ, and so, God knows what this heathen was doing. Now, this bears on the question of being and becoming in a particular sense that I want to sort of speak to. I mentioned religion. This is another sort of controversial sort of domain in terms of thinking about traditional civilization and bourgeois society, especially from the standpoint of looking back from the present. What's the status of religion? In a sense, traditional civilization could be understood as religion. In other words, it's a caste system, but also it's fundamentally religion. In other words, it's not simply what people believe, right? But it's, in a sense, the unity of theory and practice, if we were to use that kind of language, right? It's a meaningful way of life, which again, right, in the European case, the self-understanding would not have been, oh, we are, a peasant mode of production. Rather, this is Christendom, right? We are those who have heard the word and have found spiritual salvation. Religion, in this respect, so in some of these domains, we're talking about practices that attain to their concept only in modernity. That's in the way that I'm approaching this. But with religion, we're talking about something a little bit more complicated because, in fact, philosophy, science, art, even we might say politics, was religion. And religion transforms, breaks down, and becomes these different domains of practice. In other words, religion becomes science, philosophy, art, and remains as religion, but in a much attenuated form. Namely, now it's what people believe. Right? In other words, what do you believe about divinity? Not what it was, which was a comprehensive cosmology, a cosmos that people inhabited in traditional civilization. And Marx uses the term cosmos to refer to bourgeois society. He calls bourgeois society a cosmos. Right? In other words, traditional civilization was a cosmos in the sense of religion as an all-encompassing way of understanding practice and life. In bourgeois society, right, religion is no longer that. Religion becomes rather an attenuated version of itself. It's not an all-encompassing, unified cosmology, but rather that cosmology, according to Marx, is bourgeois society. In other words, there's a bourgeois cosmos. This is the phrase that he uses. I think it's in The Class Struggles in France. He talks about how England is the demiurge of the bourgeois cosmos. And he chooses his words carefully. The demiurge of the bourgeois cosmos. And so what we're dealing with here, that I want to emphasize, is that the breakdown of traditional civilization and the rise of bourgeois society is a qualitative transformation in humanity. Right, and what it means to be human, in human life. It's a qualitative change in our cosmos. And so that raises some questions that I also want to underscore. Namely, how do we understand this transformation? And I guess in that respect, one of the points of discussion in the exchange between Comrade McNair and myself has been the issue of continuity and change. In other words, if we talk about transformation, we're talking about two things simultaneously, continuity and change. What I want to emphasize is not simply the break, right, the change, but rather the transformation as a qualitative transformation. In other words, as a substantive transformation. The substance of humanity has changed. And that's what I'm trying to indicate here by talking about the self-understanding of traditional civilization as religion religion as a cosmos, that there's something substantive about this transformation. In this respect, I think that the underlying assumption of Marxism, of Marx's own thought, and of many who followed him, was that bourgeois society represented a qualitative transformation on the order of magnitude of the Neolithic Revolution. That this is what the category of primitive communism refers to, for example, right? That drawing that sort of demarcation in history, referring to the pre-agricultural revolution form of humanity as primitive communism. Or what Rousseau, in the 18th century, described as the state of nature, and described as a condition that you can see represented in some fashion by, and this isn't his expression, or rather it's a related category, the noble savage. Right? In other words, those who are closer to a state of nature. But closer to a state of nature in what respect? Closer to the original potentiality of humanity. In other words, the kind of unlimited potential for becoming of humanity. And Rousseau was explicit in saying that in invoking this, he was merely engaged in a thought experiment, that this state of nature may not have ever existed, and that he was engaged in a thought experiment precisely in order to bring into critical relief present society. In other words, the category of state of nature was not a literal past, but rather was a thought experiment in order to allow us to denaturalize and recognize critically present society, which he saw as the product of thousands of years of history, the history of civilization. This brings me around to the point with Marx. In other words, what's the point of saying that the emergence of bourgeois society is a change on the order of magnitude of the Neolithic Revolution? Earlier I said that the Neolithic Revolution represents, in a sense, a crisis of humanity. Rousseau, of course, is the characteristic thinker with respect to this in the 18th century. Namely, was this change good for humans or not? Right? This is a fundamental ambivalence that the emergence of bourgeois society casts the history of civilization in a particular light, such that one could regret the entire history of civilization in a certain respect, right, as a sort of fall from grace, a kind of diversion from the original potential of humanity. Right. In so doing, what Rousseau is registering, and I think that thinkers like Kant and Hegel were following Rousseau on this, and Marx is also following Rousseau on this, that bourgeois society cast behind it a fundamentally ambivalent view of the history of civilization, because it itself was a crisis of that civilization. The bourgeois society is the crisis not of humanity, which we can kind of put back to the rise of civilization, but rather the crisis of civilization. And the question about bourgeois society in terms of the Marxist view is, what is the significance of bourgeois society in history? And the fundamental ambiguous character of the place of bourgeois society in history, namely that it can appear in two very radically different respects. It can appear as the culmination of civilization, the perfection of civilization, the perfection of the rule of man by man, right? The perfection of enslavement. This is the kind of language that Rousseau used. The perfection of civilization. Or the possibility for something else. The possibility for a humanity beyond the history of civilization. In other words, bourgeois society occupies the ambivalent position of being the culmination of civilization and the beginning of a post-civilizational form of humanity. For Marx, this is indicated very specifically as a characteristic of the history of the 19th century. So we have Rousseau in the 18th century is registering the effects of several hundred years of the emergence of bourgeois society, the crisis of traditional civilization. But when Marx was writing in the 19th century, there's rather a different question being posed. We might say that Marx specified this ambivalent character of bourgeois society as both the culmination of the history of civilization and pointing beyond it to something new, to another qualitative change. And for Marx, and you can see this in the manifesto, but you can also see it in Engels' writings in 1847 and late 1847, that are sort of the first drafts of the Communist Manifesto. The Industrial Revolution, right, puts a finer point on bourgeois society as the crisis of civilization. And the reason for this is that the Industrial Revolution throws the character of bourgeois society as a society based on the condition of the urban working class into crisis, doubt, etc. What is the future of this form of society? For Marx, the Industrial Revolution is, in a sense, the culmination of bourgeois society and the possibility of going beyond bourgeois society. So there's a historical change that Marx himself is looking back on. It's a recent contemporary change and is living through. Namely, the transformation and crisis of bourgeois society itself. In other words, if bourgeois society was the crisis of civilization, then the Industrial Revolution was the crisis of bourgeois society. And this is where Marx uses the term capital to refer to bourgeois society in crisis.
Refer to what? Refer to?
Capital.
Capital is bourgeois society in crisis. In other words, what's the point of calling it capital? Like, what's the point of writing a book called Capital? Right. Capital is about the self-contradiction and crisis of the bourgeois cosmos. Right, and he has his term for this is to refer to it as capital. That we no longer live in bourgeois society the way people since the Renaissance and the Reformation, and, from the early modern period, lived in bourgeois society as an emergent form of society. That for Marx, we no longer simply live in bourgeois society, but rather we live in capital. Right? And this is a deliberately estranging, alienating, kind of reified term, right? To say it's not bourgeois society, it's capital. It's bourgeois society become alienated from itself. And this is something that Spencer will talk about on Thursday. But namely, that all the categories of self-understanding of bourgeois society appeared to be reversed in their meaning. Right? And so I want to sort of end on this specific issue of the self-understanding of bourgeois society in the relationship to classical antiquity. So I mentioned all of these categories, many of which have roots in classical antiquity in terms of categories of self-understanding of the human condition. So of course for Aristotle, right, human nature is captured by the phrase Zoon politikon. In other words, what are humans? We are animals that create our own communities. Right? We can create our own polis. We can create a community based on our own values. And so we're the animals that are political. Political in what sense? In the sense that we form communities based on values that we create. So the Zoon politikon was a sort of term from classical antiquity that seems to have a purchase again in bourgeois society. Right? In other words, humanity is free, the degree to which it's free to create a community of its own values, of its own value system of its own creation. Not a value system divinely ordered, as in the religious cosmology. So the question is, what is the value of the community that we've created for ourselves in bourgeois society. What has become of the Zoon politikon in bourgeois society? Well, the Zoon politikon in bourgeois society is rather homo faber and homo economicus. In other words, what are we? We're not merely the animals that create a community of our own value system, but rather we are the creatures that create a community of our own value system where the highest value is productivity, producing. We make the world and we make ourselves, and we do so with efficiency. Homo faber, homo economicus. Right? That now the history of humanity casts back from bourgeois society a conception like that which Marx discusses in terms of mode of production. Namely, it's from the standpoint of bourgeois society that ancient peoples, traditional civilization, what are they? They're the people who toil in ignorance. They're the people who are less productive, who are less efficient. Right? Regardless of the fact that production and efficiency have no bearing on the self-understanding of humanity for thousands of years. Right? Like I said earlier, it only is from the standpoint of bourgeois society that we can talk about traditional civilization as being a peasant-based society, or that we can talk about a Neolithic revolution. Right? The ancients in traditional civilization had no conception of the Neolithic revolution. Right? It was completely off the scale of their conception, self-conception of humanity. They weren't thinking, oh, nomadic hunter-gatherers, those are the people that we were, and then we became this other thing, peasants. No, this whole history is cast back from bourgeois society. Right? There were different modes of production that succeeded each other, in which people produced themselves and produced nature in a particular way, and we do so now with more knowledge, more efficiency, greater productivity, etc. And that this is a fundamental reversal, as indicated by the passage from the Grundrisse that I handed out. In other words, that we are no longer the creatures that produce a community of our own value system, right? What Marx talks about in terms of man being the aim of production. But rather, we live in a cosmos in which the aim of man is production. That, in a sense, bourgeois society, therefore, needs to be understood as a mode of becoming. Not just a state of being, but a mode of becoming. And in this respect, we still live in bourgeois society. Marx was trying to specify it. He, in the manifesto, talks about bourgeois and proletarian. And I want to sort of end on this idea, in terms of my initial presentation, of what's meant by Marx, proletariat. It's no longer the case that we are simply a society of homo faber, homo economicus, in which we exchange the products of our labor and thus produce ourselves, produce our community, produce nature for ourselves. But rather, for Marx, we are proletarianized after the Industrial Revolution. Namely, our ceaseless process of becoming in which we're engaged, in which the aim of man is production, and unlimited by any prior yardstick unfolding of becoming in a state of freedom, that we are that, but that we are that according to a specific logic, namely the logic of capital. And as such, we've gone from being bourgeois subjects to being proletarian subjects, meaning the essential condition of humanity is not the worker in the bourgeois conception, in the sense of the self-made human being, but rather the worker in a different sense, in the sense of the humanity that is subjected to the logic of capital. Marx thought that the rise of the socialist workers' movement in the 19th century indicated a determinate possibility for going beyond a society based on the exchange of labor, based on the essential condition of being an urban worker. I want to say something else about urban, just as a sort of coda to my presentation. Urban doesn't just mean literally living in a city versus living someplace else, right? It's also, we could say, a change, a transformation from the space and time of the pastoral community of traditional civilization to the space and time of bourgeois society. Namely, it's not just the city that is urban, but rather the entire universe has been transformed into urban space and time. That's why we have a planet ringed with GPS satellites, right? That's why the entire universe becomes a grid. Right? That's why space becomes time and time becomes space in a particular way. So we're not just talking about what goes on in the city, but we're talking about a way of being, a cosmos, and again, to refer back to Marx, with respect to the rise of bourgeois society, England as the demiurge of the cosmos of bourgeois society. That this is not something that simply is localized, but rather it's about a sort of, we could say, a transformation of a social metaphysics in which not just the workers, and not just the bourgeoisie, namely the capitalists, but rather all of society becomes subjected to bourgeois space and time. And that the Industrial Revolution marks a fundamental crisis of bourgeois space and time. And I'll end on with a sort of homage to my professor, Moïse Postone at the University of Chicago, who has a great way of describing the crisis of capital as the crisis of bourgeois society. That capital bursts the bounds of Newtonian space and time, or of bourgeois space and time. Right? And that's both for good and for ill. Namely, it bursts the bounds of Newtonian space and time, bounds of the urban space, if you will, or the metaphysics of bourgeois society, but in a way that we have not mastered, but rather in a way that subjects us to a logic and a destructive logic. My case that I'm trying to lay out here is that this sort of fundamental understanding of the place of bourgeois society in the history of humanity has been lost in terms of the history of Marxism in favor of the idea that bourgeois society is ambivalent in another sense, right? That it's the coexistence of a social principle of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalists, with coexisting with the social principle of the working class, right? Namely, it's the contradiction of private property and labor. Rather, I would locate, and I think that I have warrant for this, the contradiction at a different level. Namely, that it's the self-contradiction of bourgeois society after the Industrial Revolution, the transformation and crisis of bourgeois space and time, in which it's the condition of the workers that has come into crisis. In other words, it's the condition of a society based on the exchange of labor that's come into crisis. It's not simply that the capitalist class and their social principle has come into crisis by virtue of the emergence of a new social principle, that of the workers. But rather, the social principle of the workers' cosmos is itself what's come into crisis, because this is the underlying cosmology of the bourgeois epoch. Not what the capitalists do, but rather a society based on the condition of the urban laborer, or more generally, by the metaphysics of the social exchange of labor. That's it.
I think what we've got here, in a sense, it's quite an interesting, very interesting paper. You know, what we've got here is something which turns on a passage from Marx at his most Hegelian. The Grundrisse is precisely Marx at his most Hegelian. Marx, he's just set up, he says, he writes to Engels and he says, I happened to come across, I got this copy of Bakunin's copy of Hegel's Logic, which I can't remember who it was, gave to me, obviously nicked from Bakunin or borrowed and never returned from Bakunin. And this has been of great use to me in working out the categories. And so the Grundrisse exceptionally Hegelian. The first part of Capital One is quite Hegelian. The second part of Capital One is not very Hegelian at all. And in fact, the French translation, the French version, which is the last version that Marx actually edited, is even less Hegelian. And the postscript to the second German edition contains substantial distancing from Hegel. Flip side of it, what it hasn't got in it at all in terms of the historical account is the historical account, the historical narrative which is given in the German ideology, and which is repeated in the Anti-Düring, which, although it is by Engels under the not under the supervision of Marx, but in circumstances where we know that Marx read every part, contributed part of it, read every part of it before it was categorized and so on and so forth. So the center of this, as far as this is concerned, there's two issues. One of which is, as it were, the philosophical issue, which I don't think I want to address actually, simply because it just takes us off into complex history of the Enlightenment stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But is the extent to which the categories are determinative, the extent to which cosmos is determinative, the extent to which it's possible to think outside of categories, the extent to which becoming, in relation to being and becoming, the question is becoming necessarily tied to the ought? Yeah. Now in Hegel, you're quite correct that in Hegel, becoming is necessarily tied to the ought. I am a long way from being convinced that in Marx, becoming is tied to the ought at all. Yeah. But this issue, which is then posed, and this is why the German ideology, there is, and this is in Hegel as well as in Marx, evolution from development from Adam Smith's stages of society, from Vico and other 18th century conceptions of history. And the insistence which is present in this, which is present in the German ideology and is present thereafter, that there is a profound difference between the medieval and the antique. There is not a single entity, civilization, yeah, which exists as a category from the moment of the Neolithic Revolution. This is systems of the command of man by man. It is not a single entity in which the world is perceived. It's not even a single entity, we know now, it's not even a single entity in terms of the point, the antique authors were perfectly, they had a conception of the golden age, when it was not necessary to till the land, which is expressed in biblical thought as the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, but is present in the Greek and Latin writers as it's a falling off. It's from the Golden Age to the Age of Bronze to the Age of Iron, which is the dark world of class society in which we now live. So they do have a conception of themselves in this. It's true they don't have a conception of themselves as a peasant society, but then of course they aren't a peasant society. The people of classical antiquity, yes, there is the means by which the agriculture is organised is not the same as in antiquity, is not the same as in medieval society. And there is a profound distinction in medieval society similarly about this question, in the sense that medieval Christendom involves a conception of the dignity of labour. And this conception of the dignity of labour in medieval Christendom is connected with both the presence of the peasantry not as merely the ground on which traditional, the hierarchy of traditional, of a tributary traditional society rests, but as a part of the society, the peasantry, those who work, those who fight, and those who pray, and those who work are bifurcated between the urban and the rural workers, but they are part of the society in a way in which the slaves are not part of the society in classical antiquity. Okay, why is this? Why does this bear on? This bears on the nature of bourgeois society, the nature of crisis of bourgeois society, the nature of revolution, the nature of what is meant by in contradictions of bourgeois society, the role of the workers' movement, and so on and so forth. In the theory which is in the German ideology, and which is sort of on one side in pre-capitalist mode of production, but is there in the preface to the contribution to the political economy, and is there again in the anti-Düring and in Marx's later work, is not that the transition from capitalist society to socialism, communism, call it what you will, is a transition. It is, so let's put it this way, it is a transition which is of the order of the transition to the emergence of class society in the Neolithic, but it is also a transition, also and simultaneously, a transition which is of the order of the transition from antiquity to feudalism, of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. In your account, the major weakness I find is the non-recognition of these transitions, and I find it particularly problematic because actually it's an absolutely standard trope of bourgeois liberal, of the liberal critique of Marxism.
Oh no.
In relation to the assertion that what we have in Marxism is a teleology, that the sequence of modes of production is, the idea of sequence of modes of production is teleological, is Eurocentric, that we have to understand the world in terms of the existence of traditional society, which is essentially peasant society, which is all hierarchies on top of an unrecognized peasant society. In relation to the point about the dignity of labour, and the scope of religion, and the point, I suppose, that the authors of the Book of Pavia in the 11th, 12th century, who were writing about Lombard, the law of Lombardy, divided themselves into two camps, who they called the antiqui, the oldsters, and the moderni, the advocates of modernity. The Patricia Crone, who is a bourgeois author, and John A. Hall, similarly bourgeois author, confronted with this idea of the traditional society, come to the conclusion, actually we cannot date the divergence of Europe out of traditional society to the emergence of capitalism, or indeed the Industrial Revolution. We have to date the emergence of European specialists to the creation of an unstable society, a society which is constantly in presence of change and tending to break down, which is feudalism. Wow. The authors writing on medieval Japanese society, that we're already in dynamism, we're already in becoming, we're not in just in being. The pre-modern is not just being, the pre-modern is becoming. And is in fact true of classical antiquity and of indeed of ancient Chinese society. This is also a becoming, it's a different kind of becoming. So there are a whole load of other issues which one could raise, but those are the issues which I wish to raise at this point. Simply, I think this is a mutilated Marx, because it is Marx at his most Hegelian. The result is a mutilated Marx, and one which loses a good half, perhaps more than half, of how Marx's theoretical argument is constructed.
I said that I was going to emphasize the sort of theoretical and philosophy of history issues. but that I wanted to relate them back to the practical political issues. I think that two things. The issue of Marx at his Hegelian and whether Marx at his Hegelian at his most Hegelian is teleological. I think that problem goes back to Hegel. Namely, is Hegel teleological? And if Hegel is teleological, what is the meaning of teleology in Hegel? Hegel, I would say, is teleological, but not in the sense of a teleology, a future-oriented teleology. In other words, that society has been and continues to move towards a future telos, or end goal, but rather the teleology in Hegel is specific with respect to the present. Namely, as he puts it in the lectures on the Introduction to the Philosophy of History, that philosophical history, in his definition of what he thought he was trying to do, was about the eternally present. This is a sort of cryptic term of his, namely to regard the present as the goal of the past, but in the sense of the present as a moment of freedom. In other words, how does history look to be leading to the present when the present is understood as an emergent moment of becoming and freedom? And so it's not that in feudal society that there was a telos, namely bourgeois society, that was emergent. But rather, nor, in that sense, is there a socialism that is a telos, a future inherent in bourgeois society. But rather, the present as a moment of becoming, as a moment of freedom, with respect to potential and possibility. In other words, not that there is a society beyond capital, inherent in capital, but rather, could the present be turned into an opportunity for freedom? And how do we understand the present with respect to the potential for becoming? My point with respect to this is that in losing what I consider to be an essential horizon for self-understanding in Marxism, what happens is that the dynamic of crisis and reproduction in capital, rather than in bourgeois society, but in capital, namely with the Industrial Revolution and afterwards, tends to reproduce a self-understanding owing to the self-understanding of the revolt of the Third Estate. Namely, that we repeat the revolt of the Third Estate over and over again. We repeat the revolt of the toilers, of the workers, against arbitrary authority, right? Against the corruption of the community, the corruption of politics. That we do that again and again, and that is indeed how capital is reproduced. In other words, that in the post-industrial revolution world, we are liable to be bourgeois subjects in a particular sense, in the sense of our discontents being characteristically bourgeois, in which we revolt against arbitrary authority, the corruption of the community by particular interests, etc., etc. All of the sort of classical self-understanding of the bourgeois revolution is repeated. And that we're held back by that conception, that conception is potentially constraining. The flip side of that I want to mention is key, however, which is that we can't help but express our discontents living in this form of society, living under capital. That we can't help but recapitulate the revolt of the Third Estate, right? To talk about the essence of the community in terms of the laboring masses against arbitrary authority and particular interests that's falsely generalized. And on one hand, we are bound to reproduce the bourgeois revolution, and that Marx's question is, does the Industrial Revolution indicate that even though we are nevertheless bound to repeat the revolt of the Third Estate, does that revolt point beyond it? Or does it only point to the reproduction of capital? right? The reproduction of bourgeois society, but in a more and more crisis-riven state. Namely, that we reproduce, that every crisis of bourgeois society is an opportunity to reproduce and reconstruct, reconstitute a society based on labor, a society based on work. But that is the logic of capital. In other words, the logic of capital, what we were talking about earlier today at Hillel Tichton's talk, with respect to the crisis of capital as an opportunity for the reproduction of capital. And I mentioned in the Q&A then, not opportunities for the revalorization of capital, but rather opportunities for the revalorization of labor. In other words, that every crisis of capital allows for the reconstitution of labor as the basis of society. Whereas in fact, from Marx's perspective, our essential condition after the Industrial Revolution, the task of freedom that humanity faces is transcending a society based on the exchange of labor, based on the principle of humanity as homo faber and homo economicus, as the beings that produce and produce with ever greater efficiency. Right? That we are liable to think of our own discontents in capital, to imagine socialism and communism in terms of the bourgeois revolution, whereas in fact, and Marx is very clear about this in his early writings, like in the economic and philosophic manuscripts and the letter to Ruga for a ruthless criticism of everything existing, that he considers the form of discontents in capital after the Industrial Revolution as one-sided, partial, projecting a future that nevertheless there's a potential impossibility beyond the future that's projected from present discontents. In other words, that communism is not the end goal of humanity, but is rather the way that we are discontented living under capital. It is the next step in the struggle for human freedom, but it's not the goal. Right? What I think happens is that something is smuggled in where communism becomes the goal, becomes the telos. And that's a projection of the characteristic discontents of the revolt of the Third Estate, which we are liable to, in a sense, falsely narrow our horizons to those concerns without recognizing that the crisis of bourgeois society in the Industrial Revolution means going beyond that. I would challenge the idea that, I have a twofold answer. I would challenge the idea that humanity was understandable, comprehensible, whether objectively or subjectively, as being constituted by social relations prior to bourgeois society. I mean, I would say that one aspect of considering bourgeois society to be an aborted revolution is to say that maybe the cultural conservatives are right. Namely, that bourgeois society is simply the destruction of all human values, right? And that in that respect, we've lost religion. When Mahmoud Ahmadinejad writes his open letter to George W. Bush and says, you've given this liberal democratic capitalism, you and the West have given this liberal democratic capitalism a good run for its money, but can't we see that that doesn't work? Right? Shouldn't you return to Christianity the way we're returning to Islam? Right? Because in fact, it's not social relations. Right? In other words, religion, that cosmos, is not social relations in the way that we must think about our condition as social relations. In other words, the idea that, to use this category from the Hegelian Marxism or from Marxist Hegelianism, the commodity form. The commodity form is a way that we relate to nature, the way we relate to others, and the way we relate to ourselves, right? In a sense, the commodity form is the emergence of social relations as such, right? To say, we relate to nature, to physical nature, to the world in a particular way. Do you think the ancients had a different conception of that? Well, first of all, nature was divine. and we had a place in nature. We were part of a great chain of being. We lived in a differentiated world, an internally differentiated world that was divinely ordered. We had a place in it. We didn't relate to it. We didn't relate to it as an object of transformation and as an object of self-transformation, in the way that we must necessarily think of our place in the universe in those terms. I mean, just very simply, we can look at the ecological destruction and we can say, rather than humanity existing in a divinely ordered universe, that life on Earth might depend on human custodianship to continue. In other words, that many species will probably only continue if we take care of them. Right?
Including the platypus.
Absolutely. And so, I would sort of push back on the idea that, what we're talking about is social relations then and social relations now. I think that we inevitably regard the past now in terms of how did they relate? How did they relate to nature? How did they relate to each other? How did they relate to themselves? But that's our projection onto a past that I think is quite alien. In other words, when I emphasize qualitative transformations of humanity, we might be able to understand Paleolithic life of human beings and post-Neolithic life of human beings and different moments in civilization. We might be able to, relate in some way to that condition of humanity, but we can also relate to chimpanzees and whales and dolphins, and we can sort of say things about the way they live, and even in certain respects their self-understanding. But that we have to be careful about this being a function of what it means to us and where it's coming from in terms of our social relations. Now, okay, so that's one sort of point. Why do I homogenize? Because this is what happens, right? Why do I homogenize traditional civilization? Why do I just refer to it in one grand sweep? One reason why I do so is that I think that bourgeois society, and more specifically the society of capital, is as alien to the history of Europe and the history of the West, if that's even a category that we could use. It's as much a qualitative transformation and as alien to that tradition as it is to any other tradition in any other part of the world. In other words, that capital is not more related to the history of Europe than to the history of Islam or the history of South Asia or East Asia or Africa. That the warrant of regarding this as traditional civilization, to core, is just to say that the task facing humanity has in fact become homogenized in a particular way. In other words, people throughout the world are tasked by living in the cosmos of bourgeois society, living in the cosmos of capital, in a way that, of course, casts history in a particular light. In other words, the warrant of this is to say that what do we make of the fact, of course, traditional civilization is not simply a static proposition. And various civilizations went into crisis, decline, transformation. But that those crises and moments of decline and those transformations were inherently about the possibility for the rise of a new form of something that, from our standpoint, looks the same, right? And Marx has a way of talking about that. There were peasant revolts, right? But peasant revolts brought forth new dynasties. In other words, they didn't bring forth bourgeois society before a certain point in history. It's not to say that there was no change, but rather, how do those changes, how do we understand those changes with respect to the present? The danger, as I was saying, is that we regard the dynamism of feudalism or the dynamism of various ancient civilizations as being fundamentally like the dynamism of our own society, or the dynamism, the breakdown, the change that led to bourgeois society. So that's one issue. Society beyond work. Society beyond work. I think that in bourgeois society, that we're not simply talking about work and labor in the sense that even though medieval Christendom might have had a notion of the dignity of labor, I think that essentially there was a sort of neutrality towards the category of work and labor. In other words, there was, it could have dignity, meaning it counted for something. You had a place in the world, certainly, within that religious cosmology. But that, to use a gross oversimplification and another homogenizing sort of way of categorizing it, that work was, in a sense, the profane realm, right? It was, and it could have dignity, the way all creaturely existence could have dignity. But that again, when we're thinking about work, when we're thinking about labor, we're thinking about it in a very particular way. And so, for instance, in bourgeois society, all sorts of human activity have a relationship to labor and work. There's a sort of homogenizing that we can talk about, for instance, you'll see in the popular culture, you'll see what's the value of women's work in child rearing, right? If women were to be paid the value of their labor in raising children, what would it be in a dollar amount, right? And that's a peculiar way of approaching that question, right? In other words, is that work? Is that labor? Well, in bourgeois society, it is, because in a sense, all human activity becomes labor, becomes work. That's the point of the Grundrisse passage, that it's natural and in a certain respect appropriate for women to turn around and say, what about the work I do? It's not wage labor, but it's work. And what if I were to be paid for it? What would be its worth? Right? But again, that points to something, because in ancient civilization, you had qualitative distinctions among different forms of human activity. They weren't just forms of labor. They weren't just forms of work. Right? Doing this and doing that, there was no common category for grasping that. Even though now we might be tempted to project back and say, what did people do? How did they produce themselves? How did they relate to nature? What was the work that they did? I think that a post-capitalist society would still involve human activity, right? But the question is, would human activity be subsumable under this category of work, of production? And, inevitably, we think in those terms, but I think that a future form of humanity beyond bourgeois society, beyond capital, would not necessarily have this common category for grasping all human activity as self-production, right? To go back to that Grundrisse passage, that we produce ourselves, right? It's a question. Did the ancients, in other words, did the ancients have man as the aim of production or humanity as the aim of production? Well, there are so many categories built into that. Humanity, production, aim, that are really extrinsic to the self-understanding of what people did, right, to their activity, to the essence of their lives. So, around to the question of the dodginess of left Hegelianism, or what appears to be a kind of recrudescence of left Hegelianism in the 20th century, with characters like Lukács and Benjamin and Adorno and others, and perhaps even Metzaros. I actually don't really know Metzaros' work. That's sort of, I'm innocent of it. Kept myself innocent of it in certain respects. And so I'll leave the question of Metzaros alone. But whether or not this kind of thinking is mystifying in some way, mystificatory in some way, has that function. I think that Lukács' History and Class Consciousness, that he wrote that for his comrades in the Third International, and that the fact that we look back on it now and treat it as abstruse philosophical speculation it says more about us than it does about him. I think that he thought he had an audience in the Third International for that book, and that the fact that it appears to be obscure Hegelianism tells us what we've lost. In other words, tells us that a certain kind of self-understanding has been cut out from under us. And, so that leaves us in a position of, I don't know, I think that Mike in one of the articles talked about how doing history was once based on scholastic exegesis, but has now become a matter of science and interrogating sources and this kind of thing. I think that there's a reason why the history of Marxism has become a scholastic exegetical project, like why it appears to be, this sort of ancient scripture that's inscrutable, and it means, different things to different people, and even different things to the same person at different times. But I think that it's an index of, again, how a certain kind of self-understanding is disintegrated. My short answer on, what Lukács was about, and even what Benjamin is about in the Theses on the Philosophy of History, without defending that text as some kind of clear exposition, because it isn't. I would say that these are people who were trying to provoke self-reflection, self-recognition on the part of Marxists. In other words, they were writing for other Marxists, and they were assuming a lot in terms of addressing other Marxists. And that, it's become opaque to us because Marxism is disintegrated. In other words, the very sort of self-understanding has been cut out from under us. I don't think that it's actually all that obscure. I think that you can read Lukács in tandem with Lenin and Luxemburg, and it can come together. You can read things like Reform and Revolution, the mass strike, and State and Revolution, what is to be done, left-wing communism, and you can read that stuff and read Lukács. And that then Lukács seems like a meta-commentary on those texts, and it sort of all comes together, in fact. And whether or not his speculation, his meta-commentary, is useful or not is a different question. But I think that that's essentially what it is. That he thought he was writing for other members of the Third International, and then he was denounced, and then he decided, okay, that doesn't work, and maybe what I thought the movement was about, it's not about. Either wasn't about or is no longer about. And so I think that Lukács, the late Lukács, does make his peace with Stalinism in a way. As a way of, saying, well, the movement seems to be going this way rather than that way, and I don't want to be ejected from the movement, and so I'll try to pose my issues in a different manner. So the fact that the Hegelian dimension of Marxism has a recrudescence, it might appear to be regrettable in the sense that if you imagine that Marx transcended his Hegelianism, then the idea would be that when Marxists become Hegelian again in the 20th century, that's a sort of falling away from or a kind of regression behind Marx's own development. I don't think that is exactly what happened. I think that Marx appropriated Hegel under changed historical circumstances. He thought that Hegel's attempt to reflect upon bourgeois society was appropriate for reflecting on the consciousness of the socialist workers' movement, and that he wrote Capital with an audience in mind, namely with the socialist workers' movement that existed, that was not Marxist, that was highly ideologically variegated. That movement, activists in that movement, could recognize themselves in the critical account of political economy that he gave. And I think that Lukács tried to do the same thing with respect to the Second International and the Third International, that he thought that he could write to provoke the self-reflection and self-recognition of a movement that was established, underway, developed, and that he could, in a sense, force them to recognize or provoke them to recognize the dialectic of their own movement in the way that Marx had done in the 19th century with non-Marxist socialism. That he could raise the self-consciousness of the movement. Lukács, I think, tried to do the same thing, and Benjamin tried to do the same thing in his own way, and Lukács got burned for it. Benjamin, died, and so becomes this kind of object of weird veneration, etc. But I think that that's the essence of it. And the fact that it appears to be very obscure to us simply means that we don't share the frame of reference that they had for the movement that they were trying to provoke self-recognition. I guess in terms of Jerry and Stan, how those questions linked back up, that Hegel's categories were categories of thought. I would sort of dispute that, because I would say that Hegel inherits from Kant the idea of trying to raise practice to the level of self-consciousness. In other words, what makes this modern idealism is specifically that it's not a kind of Platonic idealism or even a Descartes' idealism in terms of the possibility of knowledge, right? That the possibility of knowledge is understood as a practical matter, meaning that we know the world the way we do as a function of our practice in the world. So there is, unfortunately, with Hegel, a kind of necessary kind of interpretation in terms of the categories that he uses, that what he means by the unfolding of an idea is not that, in the beginning there was the word, right? It's not this kind of ancient idealism. Or even the category of God in Hegel, which I think speaks to some of the other questions that came up. So I'm going to try to sort of link this all in. Namely, that we have to ask the Hegelian question of what is the rational object of the concept of God. Meaning, were the ancients, because they believed in divinity and God, were they simply ignorant? Right? Was it ignorance, was it superstition, or rather was it a form of knowledge? And a form of knowledge, not of an external world, but again, a cosmology, meaning a form of self-knowledge, not just a form of knowledge of the external world or physical nature. It wasn't like an imperfect science, but it was a qualitatively different form of reason. In other words, it was human reason, but in a qualitatively different form and with different concerns. And so in that respect, I think that Hegel is actually interested in drawing not just a line of discontinuity, but a line of continuity between the ancient and the modern. Namely, that we were talking about the qualitative transformation of human reason, not just the improvement of human reason over time, not just a quantitative account, that we know more about the world than people in the ancient world did, but rather that we know the world differently than they did. And that the reason that we know the world differently than they did is that we are different from them. We've changed ourselves. That idea of the unfolding of reason is a story of the practical self-transformation of humanity. In other words, it's not just a change in the way we think, but it's actually a change in the way we live. That, theory and practice in that sense, there's a dialectic of theory and practice. That when we're talking about the transformation of human reason, we're talking about the transformation of human practices. And so even the concept of reflection, the idea that human practices are reflected in thought, that means something different from, that there's just a projection into thought. But rather that thought is the self-understanding of practices. And that undergoes a qualitative transformation. It's not that we understand what we do now simply more than people in the past understood what they did, but rather that we understand it differently because we ourselves are different. That's the sort of underlying idea of qualitative transformation that I would point to. Now, right, in terms of the crisis of humanity, I would say that I'm agnostic on the Neolithic Revolution. Namely, I don't know that I would be a partisan in the Neolithic Revolution, that it's a revolution and it's a counter-revolution. What it is something whose necessity is highly obscure. Meaning, it happened. Human community transformed fundamentally. And we know that it was a disaster for individual human beings. That the well-being of human beings as animals, as, in our creaturely existence, sort of went steeply downhill as a function of the Neolithic Revolution. But we also know that this was a new form of human community that was incredibly powerful, that essentially exterminated or enslaved everyone else. And the only, humans who were not so, forcibly transformed by the Neolithic Revolution were those who were geographically isolated enough to be outside of it. I don't know that there is a natural scientific or physical materialistic explanation for the Neolithic Revolution. I think it happened. It's highly obscure. And so I'm not, I put it beyond the pale in that respect. I don't see myself as a partisan of the agricultural revolution. Because I think that its necessity is highly questionable. Its possibility, however, the fact that it could happen, says something about the nature of humanity. In other words, that humans lived a particular way and fundamentally transformed their relationship to nature and to each other and to themselves. That's a huge transformation. It's a qualitative transformation in humanity that's deeply obscure to us, which is why we can look back on it and wonder about it and say, with what necessity did that happen? Well, the question is not with what necessity it happened at the time. The question is, how do we see something of our own necessity? How do we project our own necessity into that historical occurrence? In other words, we could sort of put a happy face on it and say, oh, well, humans took a technological step in mastery of nature, right? And even of, creating a new form of human community and society. Or you could put a sort of, sad face on it and say it's the mutilation of human existence. That we're only now, like in the 20th century is the time when people start achieving a kind of, to some degree, a state of well-being, nutritionally, etc., that they had more than 10,000 years ago. So I'm agnostic, is essentially the point. As far as commodity exchange and commodity production, I don't have very much to say about that, other than I'm not sure that bourgeois society could have emerged in the ancient world. In other words, I don't see classical antiquity as literally pre-bourgeois in the same way. I think that there are rudiments that we can, in other words, we could say, well, we relate more readily to Athens than to Sparta because Athens is a more commercial society than Sparta was, et cetera, et cetera. That we can, relate to the Roman Republic in a particular way, whereas the Roman Empire looks a little strange to us, et cetera. In terms of commodity production and the history of commodity production. In a sense, I think that for Marx, we're bound to see the emergence of a commodity producing and society, and a society that produces itself as a series of commodities. We're bound to see it incipient in the past. And so he thinks that bourgeois thinkers are, that it's appropriate for them to imagine that the history of humanity is the history of proto-bourgeois society. But again, it's with what necessity society becomes a society of the exchange of labor in the commodity form. And that is, again, a deeply, I would say, a deeply ambivalent and ambiguous thing. In other words, the necessity with which bourgeois society emerges out of a breakdown of traditional civilization is highly ambivalent to my mind. Meaning, I think that if Marxism isn't right, in other words, if the Industrial Revolution is not the possibility of transcending bourgeois society, if the working class is not a historical agent for the transformation of capital to a post-bourgeois society, then the cultural conservatives might be right, which is that bourgeois society is just a disaster for humanity. It's just the complete destruction of all human values and the complete destruction of nature and just a sort of imploding cosmos. Right. And so, I think that, part of the way in which we're tasked by bourgeois society is with the terror that, that the emergence of bourgeois society was not the necessity of freedom working its way out, but was a horrible contingent accident and blind alley for humanity, if that's possible. I think that what Marxism tasks itself with is making the bourgeois revolution into an opportunity for full emancipation. And that it looks at the resources for doing so, and it looks at the way bourgeois society appropriates all of human history to itself in that respect. In other words, how does all of human history and even all of natural history become a resource for human emancipation? That might be a little bit kind of obscure, but hopefully not. What is vulgar Marxism? There are polemical characterizations of Kautsky in both Lukács and Korsch that I think that we have to find the register and the pitch at which they're made. I think that what's meant by reification for Lukács, in other words, reification in the consciousness of the proletariat, is the danger of the reification of the proletariat, if you will, or the reification of the socialist workers' movement. It's not just the reification inherent in being a worker, the quotidian existence in society, but rather that the highest expression of the socialist workers' movement, namely Marxism, stood in danger of becoming reified. And that the category of vulgar Marxism in Korsch is a sort of an analogous critique of Marxism become reified. Now, we might dispute over the characterization of that self-reification of Marxism, and we also might mistake the register of the polemic. In other words, what kind of critique of Kautsky is being made? What's meant by this proper noun Kautsky, right? Is it like from the day that Kautsky was born, he was vulgar Marxist, or did he become vulgar Marxist, or did he become an exponent of vulgar Marxism after Marxism itself had become reified, etc.?
Engels of vulgar Marxism.
Exactly. It just becomes this kind of, right, the original sin, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that the original sin argument is useless. Useless, absolutely, and very inhibiting and very generative of sectarianism, definitely, I agree with all of that. About the bourgeois revolution, and I think that I might only have time for that. I mean, I wanted to get back maybe to Abdul's point before I come around to the bourgeois revolution, and that is, it speaks to the point that I was making about religion, and from Hegel's perspective, religion being a form of reason. Well, what's also Hegelian is the idea that these other transformations of humanity, that the history of humanity is a history of self-transformation, means that even a slave society is an expression of human freedom in the sense that it shows the transformability of humanity, and that transformability takes the form of a human community. In other words, it doesn't exist at the level of the individual, but exists at the level of the community. And, to say, in other words, it's the insistence on recognizing freedom in history, meaning it's not to say that those people are free, but rather to say that the society that they've produced for themselves is a hallmark of human capacity for transforming itself. It's new, right? It's something, it's not based in nature, it's not divinely oriented, but it in fact is the self-production of humanity. And so I think that, again, it's not about a society being better or worse, it's rather about how do we recognize the history of humanity as showing the capacity for human transformation, self-transformation. The revolt of the third estate, the bourgeoisie. I think that, I don't think that the bourgeois revolution ever was the bourgeois revolution in the sense of the bourgeoisie or like capitalists. I think that the history of the bourgeois revolution is the history of plebeian revolt. I think that, like in terms of the person who, coins this revolt of the third estate idea, Abbé Sieyès, right? It's a kind of a curious figure. In other words, for the Abbé Sieyès, he could endorse Napoleon as being in the interest of the workers against the capitalists. Because in fact, that's how he came around from being, a kind of spokesperson of the revolt of the third estate. His later career is very bizarre, right? In the sense of he becomes a kind of Bonapartist in the original sense, out of some kind of sense of like, well, Napoleon can keep the capitalists under control, and therefore, if the workers' interests will be served. It's it's sort of interesting to recognize. Are the bourgeoisie a democratic class? That's not the point. I think that the point is the bourgeois revolution a democratic revolution? And what do we mean by the bourgeois revolution? It comes back to the dispute over terms. In other words, what do I mean by bourgeois? I mean the society, the urban society of the modern working class as emergent over the last several hundred years. Not just post-industrial revolution, but a longer history than that. And I do think that what we're talking about with the bourgeois revolution is the political constitution of a society in which the exchange of labor could become the predominant social principle. And so, you have all sorts of actors and agents and ideologies at work there. It goes on under the rubric of a kind of revitalized Christianity. It goes on under all sorts of rubrics. And it's an ex post facto projective term. In other words, what I'm interested in is how did Marx see the history of the emergence of bourgeois society? as he characterized bourgeois society as a society based on the cosmology of labor, essentially. My final point, because I know I'm running out of time. Right, so I'm owing a lot of my argument to, my professor Moïse Postone's approach to reading Marx and and the understanding of capital that he gets from his interpretation of Marx. I'm most familiar with, Moïse's thinking in that respect. What I do know, because my conversations with him have been limited with respect to politics, but what I do know is that characterizing him as a Zionist is not quite right, and I think that he might have taken some positions at certain points that would appear to maybe be apologetic for dimensions of Israeli politics that, have the character of Zionism, maybe. But that I don't think that either in his self-understanding or actually that his politics is Zionist. It all depends on what's meant by Zionism. My one example of this, maybe to sort of raise from casual, purely anecdotal conversation, was with respect to the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt and the ceding of the Sinai back to Egypt. And he said that he thought that it was a mistake that the Israeli settlers in the Sinai were forced to repatriate to Israel, because he thought that it confused, in the typical Zionist manner, I think the way he put it was, it confused territoriality for sovereignty. In other words, he thought that Jews could have democratic self-determination in Egypt, but they didn't have to live in Israel to have that. That, to me, indicates that he's not a Zionist. Whatever one might take about various positions that he's had, I don't think that's Zionism. And he actually said that forcing the settlers in the Sinai to repatriate to Israel was part of a deliberate move to create a right-wing constituency for Zionism in Israel. In other words, it showed that if we give up territory, you'll be forced to move. It was to make people more Zionist, and that he opposed that. He thought that that was politically awful. Yeah.